to the last election. Now, not everything the president says on Twitter is factually accurate, but to anyone who's been in Washington for a while, that claim didn't seem crazy or even really that unlikely. That sort of thing does happen here, and everybody knows it. So imagine how confusing it was to see a parade of prominent Washington figures leap forward to denounce Trump's claim as not just untrue, but insane. Speaker of the House Paul Ryan confidently told reporters that, quote, "We have not seen any evidence of wiretapping at Trump Tower or on anyone within Trump Tower." Richard Burr and Mark Warner, those are the two top senators on the Senate Intel Committee, and they would know. They dismissed the claim as well. The Justice Department denied surveilling Trump staff, as did then FBI Director Jim Comey, while giving sworn testimony before Congress. So suspicions confirmed, the media laughed derisively. Wiretapping? Come on. That's tinfoil hat stuff. It's nuts. Now, in another time, with more trustworthy institutions, that would have been the end of the story. But we live in a country with deeply corrupt institutions, and so it turns out all those patronizing assurances that nobody's spying on political campaigns were false, and probably intentionally so. According to a new report from CNN, Paul Manafort, who for a time last year was Trump's campaign chairman, was wiretapped by the federal government both before and after the election. Now, Manafort, it ought to be noted, had an apartment inside Trump Tower during that time. So it's virtually certain that surveillance of him would have included other members of the Trump campaign staff, maybe even Trump himself. In other words, it looks like Trump's tweet may have been right. So why did three top members of Congress from both parties and the country's top law enforcement officer all assure us the surveillance didn't happen, that there wasn't a shred of evidence to suggest it had happened? Were they lying, or did they simply not know? Neither answer is comforting. Either the intelligence agency has gone rogue, pursuing its own goals without meaningful oversight from elected officials, or our officials are colluding with one another to lie to the public, apparently for political reasons. Either way, something ominous is happening in Washington. Last year's election terrified the permanent class here, mostly because it was a genuine populist uprising that they couldn't control despite all efforts. Since the election, they've done everything in their power to reverse the result or simply pretend it never happened. In an ironic twist, they become exactly what they claim to oppose. They collude behind closed doors to push a narrative of secret collusion. They compare the president to Vladimir Putin and then use secret surveillance and politically motivated leaks to menace their political enemies. And then, for good measure, they lie about it. In the name of protecting democracy, they're doing everything they can to subvert the results of a democratic vote. Irony of ironies. No Russian hacking has ever threatened this country more than that. Solomon Weisenberg served as a deputy independent counsel during Ken Starr's investigation of the Clinton administration those many years ago, and he joins us tonight. Mr. Weisenberg, thanks a lot for coming on. It seems like...
Thank you. Many years ago.
Many years ago. I remember it very well. It seems like, to civilians like me, a very big deal for the federal government, independent prosecutor or anyone working for the federal government to initiate a wiretap against a campaign official in the middle of a campaign. Would that have given you pause? Does that seem weird to you?
I think it's worrisome if it happened. We don't really know for sure whether it happened. And I think, Tucker, it's good to keep something in mind for you and all your viewers to keep it in mind. Having been through and participated in a high-profile investigation like this, you can just assume that 50% of what you read, at a minimum, about what Mueller is doing is utterly false. And you can assume that at least 50% of what Mueller is doing at any given time is not in the papers, and you have no idea what it is. Now, that being said,
by the way, that's my assumption about everything. Everything I hear in Washington, I take 50% off the top of everything. But this specific allegation that he was wiretapped, that Manafort was a subject of government surveillance, is something that's been floating around for a while, and it does seem possible to me. Does it seem possible to you?
Well, certainly in light of the CNN story, it does. Now, you always have to look at who is sourcing a story, but I agree with you that if something like this happened, it's very disturbing. It doesn't mean that it's automatically something that was wrong and shouldn't have happened, but I think it's very troubling anytime one administration goes and tries to get a wiretap of a major figure in the party opposing it, certainly opposing its party in the upcoming election.
Right. Well, we know what happened to Michael Flynn. I mean, we know what happened to Flynn. So, I mean, it doesn't seem crazy to assume it might have happened to Paul Manafort. So the nature of this investigation, and again, I'm discounting the 50% that you suggested, but seems to have changed, from what we can tell, from an investigation into collusion between Trump and people around him with the Russian government into an investigation that includes financial dealings going back some years, long before he entered the last race. If that is true, that does seem like mission creep on a pretty grand scale.
Well, I think Mueller has a pretty broad, if I remember his charter correctly, he has a pretty broad scope of inquiry, and that's common in investigations like this. And there's no indication that I've seen that Mueller is involved in any of these wiretap applications. But there's no question, when you bring a guy like Bob Mueller on, you're going to get a very thorough and an extremely aggressive investigation. That's the way he operates. And really, Bob Mueller doesn't care what you think or I think or anybody thinks.
Well, he ought to care what we think because we're American citizens and he's not God. And there was a New York Times piece in which you're quoted that said, and I'm not defending Paul Manafort, by the way, whom I don't know, and I'm not carrying water for Paul Manafort. That's for sure. However, in the piece it said that federal agents picked his front door, the lock on his front door, and emerged in order to scare the crap out of him. And you're quoted saying that's exactly what they were doing. What's the point of that in a free society to behave that way? Why not just ask him to open the door? It seems police state-ish to me.
Well, I wasn't speaking about the particular tactic that they used in that case of basically telling a magistrate, if the story is to be believed, there were exigent circumstances and then picking the lock. That's very unusual. What I was simply saying is that Mueller, very much like Patrick Fitzgerald in the Scooter Libby investigation, wanted to set a tone very early on, which is what prosecutors need to do when they come in on these investigations. Doesn't mean that's an excuse to act improperly, but he's setting a tone and he's letting people know, hey, folks, I'm not screwing around. This is serious. I know what I'm doing, and I'm not lollygagging around. And there's no question that he's doing that. Now, he's got a number one lieutenant, Andrew Weissman, who's very well known for doing that. The Enron investigation, Weissman, as you know, head